almost anyone, I suppose, could call himself or herself an anarchist if he or she believed that society could be managed without the state. And by the state, I don't mean the absence of any institutions, the absence of any form of social organization. The state really refers to a professional apparatus of people who are set aside to manage society, to preempt the control of society from the people. So that would include the military, judges, politicians, representatives who are paid for the express purpose of legislating, and an executive body that is also set aside from society. So anarchists generally believe that whether as groups or individuals, people should directly run society. My background and how I have become an anarchist is a long, long story. I had entered the Communist Children's Movement, an organization called the Young Pioneers of America, in 1930 in New York City. I was only 9 years of age and had gone through the entire 30s as a Stalinist initially, and then increasingly as someone who was more and more sympathetic to Trotskyism. And by 1939, after having seen Hitler rise to power, the Austrian Workers' Revolt of 1934, an almost completely forgotten episode in labor history, the Spanish Revolution, by which I mean the so-called Spanish Civil War, I finally became utterly disillusioned with Stalinism and drifted increasingly toward Trotskyism. And by 1945, I finally also became disillusioned with Trotskyism, and I would say now increasingly with Marxism and Leninism. But the essential thing, so far as I'm concerned, as I reflect upon all of this now, is that I had gone through a period of Marxism, which is almost unknown today to many American radicals, a period when Marxism was a workers' movement to a very great extent, and when it was a movement in the streets, in which hundreds of thousands of people at times could be brought out in massive demonstrations throughout the country under red flags, whether it be communist or socialist. And by the end of the Second World War, and particularly by the end of the 1940s, I literally saw this movement disappear, and disappear from history, at least as far as the United States is concerned. And I have no belief whatever that it will come back again. Namely, what I'm saying is, I saw the end of the classical workers' movement. And I had to ask myself, why had this come about? What did this mean? And the conclusion I came to is this, that the workers' movement never really had a revolutionary potential. That the factories, and I had worked in factories for 10 years, and had worked in factories partly as a labor organizer in the old CIO before it united with the AFL, when it was still in a very militant, you know what I mean, stage of its development. That this workers' movement had never really had the revolutionary potentialities that Marx attributed to it. That in point of fact, the factory, which is supposed to organize the workers in Marx's language, mobilize them and instill in them the class consciousness that is to stem out of a conflict between wage labor and capital, in fact had created habits of mind in the worker that served to regiment the worker, that served in fact to assimilate the worker to the work ethic, to the industrial routine, to hierarchical forms of organization, and that no matter how compellingly Marx had argued that such a movement could have revolutionary consequences, in fact, such a movement could have nothing but a purely adaptive function, an adjunct to the capitalist system itself. And I began to try to explore what were movements and ideologies, if you like, that really were liberatory, that really freed people of this hierarchical sensibility and mentality, of this authoritarian outlook, of this complete assimilation by the work ethic. And I now began to turn very consciously toward anarchist views, because anarchism posed the question not simply of a struggle between classes based upon economic exploitation. Anarchism really was posing a much broader historical question that even goes beyond our industrial civilization. Not just classes, but hierarchy. Hierarchy as it exists in the family. Hierarchy as it exists in the school. Hierarchy as it exists in sexual relationships. Hierarchy as it exists between ethnic groups. Not only class divisions based upon economic exploitation. And it was concerned not only with economic exploitation, it was concerned with domination. Domination which may not even have any economic meaning at all. The domination of women by men in which women are not economically exploited. The domination of ordinary people by bureaucrats, in which you may even have a welfare, so-called socialist type of state. Domination as it exists today in China, even when you're supposed to have a classless society. Domination even as it exists in Russia, where you are supposed to have a classless society. You see. So these are the things that I noted in anarchism, and increasingly I came to the conclusion that if we were to avoid, or if we are to avoid, the mistakes that were made over 100 years of proletarian socialism, if we are to really achieve a liberatory movement, not simply in terms of economic questions, but in terms of every aspect of life, we would have to turn to anarchism, because it alone posed the problem not merely of class domination, but hierarchical domination. And it alone posed the question not simply of economic exploitation, but exploitation in every sphere of life. And it was that growing awareness that we had to go beyond classes into hierarchy, and beyond exploitation into domination, that led me into anarchism and to a commitment to an anarchist outlook. I don't believe that one can practice anarchism in this society. I believe it would be utterly illusory to contend, say, that a food co-op can replace general, you know what I mean, Grand Union, or that a so-called People's Bank, to use a concept of Proudhon, who is supposed to have been an anarchist, could replace Chase Manhattan. Nor do I think that one can go around living a holier-than-thou ethical life, you know, that essentially amounts to an ongoing guilt trip against other people. I find that it is basically impossible to live a thoroughly anarchist life within a capitalist society. But I do believe this, that one can try to maintain a high ethical standard. And that is one of the beautiful things about anarchism, that it brings ethics into socialism instead of mere science into socialism, such as Marx does. That one can live an ethical life. One can concern oneself personally with what is humane and what I would prefer to call libertarian behavior. One can protest, and one can try to work with projects in which people learn how to take control of their lives, even if in fact they can't do so until there are fundamental social changes. Those are the commitments, I believe, that anarchism seriously poses to the individual. And it raises a very high standard. It is demanding in that respect. It demands that you search into what is a humanistic sensibility and what is a humanistic ethic.